Hey everyone, welcome to our ultimate guide on elemental reactions in Genshin Impact. Whether you're a newcomer or a seasoned player, understanding these reactions can really boost your gameplay. Today, we'll break down the 7 elements, dive into every type of elemental reaction, and explore how internal cooldown and elemental mastery impact your damage output. Let's get started. Elements. In Genshin Impact, there are 7 core elements you'll encounter. Pyro. Pyro abilities deal fire damage and can set enemies ablaze, inflicting burn damage over time. Pyro is essential for creating reactions like Overloaded and Melt, which enhance your overall damage output. Hydro. Hydro abilities apply a wet status to enemies, making them vulnerable to reactions. This is crucial for triggering reactions like Vaporize and Electro-Charged, which can deal significant damage when combined with other elements. Cryo. Cryo abilities can freeze enemies or slow them down. This element is useful for crowd control and creating reactions like Melt and Frozen, which help manage enemy movements and deal extra damage. Electro. Electro abilities deal electric damage and interact with other elements to create reactions like Overloaded and Electro-Charged. Electro is great for high-speed damage and continuous effects. Xingqiu. Xingqiu abilities create shields and Xingqiu constructs, offering defensive and strategic advantages. Xingqiu interacts with elements to create reactions like Crystallize, which generates protective shields, but it can't withstand heavy attacks. Anemo. Anemo abilities can swirl other elements, spreading their effects and manipulating the battlefield. This element is versatile for grouping enemies and amplifying elemental reactions. Dendro. Dendro interacts with other elements to produce reactions like Bloom and Hyperbloom. Dendro's interactions are crucial for certain strategies and reactions. Elemental reactions. Let's break down the different elemental reactions you can trigger. Overload. Overload occurs when Pyro and Electro elements combine. This reaction creates an electrical burst that deals Pyro damage. It has a 0.5 second internal cooldown, or ICD, which limits its frequency, but ensures consistent damage. Overloaded is particularly effective against groups of enemies, making it great for crowd control. By pairing Electro abilities with Pyro effects, you can maximize continuous fire damage, managing multiple foes efficiently. Melt. Melt happens when Pyro and Cryo interact. The damage dealt by Melt depends on the order of element supply. If Pyro is applied to an enemy already affected by Cryo, the reaction will deal double the damage. Conversely, if Pyro is applied first and then Cryo, the damage will be 1.5 times the normal amount. Melt has a hit-based internal cooldown, which means it applies once per attack. Timing your attacks is crucial to maximize the damage, particularly against single targets or bosses. Vaporize. Vaporize occurs when Pyro and Hydro elements combine. This reaction causes the Hydro effect to vaporize and deal Pyro damage to the target. The damage amplification depends on the order of the elements apply. If Hydro is applied first and then Pyro, the damage is doubled. If Pyro is applied first and then Hydro, the damage is increased by 1.5 times. Vaporize has a hit-based internal cooldown, influencing how frequently the reaction can occur. This reaction is great for boosting damage output, especially against enemies affected by Hydro. Frozen. Frozen is triggered when Cryo and Hydro elements combine. When an enemy is affected by both Cryo and Hydro, they become frozen, stopping their movement and making them vulnerable to additional damage. This reaction generally has a time-based internal cooldown, meaning it can apply periodically as long as Cryo and Hydro statuses are maintained. Frozen is a powerful crowd control method, allowing you to manage large groups or tough opponents effectively and set them up for additional damage. Superconduct. Superconduct occurs when Cryo and Electro elements combine. This reaction reduces the target's physical resistance by 50% for 12 seconds and deals Cryo damage to the target. Superconduct has a hit-based internal cooldown, meaning it applies once per attack. It's effective for teams that rely on physical damage, as it enhances their overall damage output by reducing enemy resistance. This reaction is essential for optimizing physical damage and handling tough enemies. Electro-Charged. Electro-Charged is triggered by combining Electro and Hydro. When an enemy affected by Hydro comes into contact with Electro, they receive continuous electro damage over time. This reaction has a time-based internal cooldown, meaning it deals damage at regular intervals. As long as the enemy remains affected by Hydro, Electro-Charged is useful for dealing sustained damage and maintaining pressure on enemies. It's effective in both single-target and multi-target scenarios. Burning occurs when Pyro and Dendro elements combine. This reaction causes the Dendro effect to catch fire, dealing continuous Pyro damage over time to enemies affected by Dendro. Burning has a hit-based internal cooldown, meaning it applies once per attack. This reaction is effective for sustained damage and managing enemies affected by Dendro. It provides continuous pressure on enemies, making it useful for prolonged fights. Crystallize is triggered by combining Xingqiu with Cryo, Hydro, Electro, or Pyro. When Xingqiu interacts with these elements, it creates a crystal that provides a shield to the character who picks it up. The shield's strength depends on the element mystery of the character that triggered the Crystallize reaction. Crystallize doesn't have a specific internal cooldown, but relies on elemental interactions to create shields. These shields can absorb damage and offer additional protection, but shields created by Crystallize reaction can't withstand heavy attacks. Bloom is triggered when Hydro and Dendro elements combine. This reaction creates Dendro cores that explode after a short delay, dealing area of effect Dendro damage to enemies within the blast radius. Bloom has a time-based internal cooldown, causing explosions at regular intervals. It's effective for dealing damage to multiple enemies and managing large groups by utilizing Hydro and Dendro effectively. Bloom can enhance your team's area damage capabilities. Hyperbloom occurs when Electro interacts with Dendro cores created by Bloom. This reaction transforms the Dendro cores into homing projectiles that deal additional Dendro damage to enemies. Hyperbloom has a time-based internal cooldown, causing projectiles to deal damage at set intervals. It's highly effective for focusing damage on specific targets and enhancing your damage output in combat scenarios. Burgeon is triggered by combining Pyro with Dendro cores, created through the Bloom reaction. This causes a large area of effect Pyro explosion from the Dendro cores, dealing high damage in the surrounding area. Burgeon has a time-based internal cooldown for Pyro damage, meaning the explosion occurs at regular intervals. It's great for dealing substantial damage to multiple enemies and handling large groups effectively. Quicken is triggered when Dendro and Electro elements combine. This reaction applies a state called Quicken to enemies, which enhances subsequent reactions like Aggravate and Spread. Quicken itself doesn't have a specific internal cooldown, but affects how frequently other reactions can occur. It boosts the damage of Aggravate and Spread, making it a valuable tool for amplifying your damage output. Aggravate occurs when Electro interacts with the Quicken state applied to enemies. This reaction boosts Electro damage against enemies affected by Quicken, increasing the damage output of subsequent Electro attacks. Aggravate is influenced by Quicken's internal cooldown, which affects how frequently can trigger. It's crucial for maximizing Electro-based damage and improving your team's effectiveness. Spread is triggered when Dendro interacts with the Quicken state applied to enemies. This reaction boosts Dendro damage against enemies affected by Quicken, enhancing the damage output of subsequent Dendro attacks. Spread is also influenced by Quicken's internal cooldown, affecting how often it can trigger. By utilizing Spread, you can increase the damage of your Dendro abilities and enhance your combat effectiveness. What is ICD? Internal Cooldown, or ICD, is a hidden cooldown timer that controls how often you can trigger elemental reactions. Even when constantly applying elements, not every hit will cause a reaction because of this internal timer, which limits how often a reaction can occur on the same enemy. ICD comes into main forms: hit-based ICD and time-based ICD. Hit-based ICD. With hit-based ICD, a reaction can only trigger after a certain number of hits, typically 3 hits or applications of an element. This is common for characters who apply elements rapidly over multiple attacks. Example: Xiangling's elemental skill. Xiangling summons Woba, which breathes fire, applying Pyro to enemies with each attack. When paired with a Hydro character like Xingqiu, this can trigger the Vaporize reaction. However, due to hit-based ICD, Vaporize won't trigger on every instance of Pyro applied by Woba. Hit-based ICD works on a 3-hit cycle, meaning that Vaporize will only trigger once every 3 hits from Guoba's flame attack. After the reaction occurs, you'll need to wait for the next 3 hits to pass before it can trigger again. This means timing your elemental abilities and attack rotations becomes crucial to maximize damage output. Time-based ICD. For time-based ICD, a reaction can only occur after a short period of time has passed, typically 2.5 seconds, even if elements are applied multiple times within that time frame. Example: when Diluc attacks, Diluc applies Pyro consistently when under the effect of his elemental burst. When paired with a Hydro character like Barbara, this combination can trigger Vaporize reactions. However, due to the time-based ICD, Vaporize will only trigger every 2.5 seconds, even if Diluc is consistently landing Pyro attacks. This means you can't trigger Vaporize with every single hit, even if you're continuously applying Pyro and Hydro elements, as the ICD creates a short window of time between each reaction. Mastering the timing is key to maximizing Diluc's damage output with Vaporize. ICD Exceptions. Some reactions and abilities work outside the standard ICD rules. Swirl. Anemo reactions. Reactions involving swirl don't follow the traditional ICD mechanics. Characters like Venti or Kazuha can trigger swirl multiple times in quick succession, rapidly spreading elements across the battlefield without being limited by ICD. Burning. Pyro plus Dendro. The burning reaction can be continuously applied with very little downtime, as its ICD is minimal, meaning enemies affected by Dendro will keep taking Pyro damage over time without much delay. That wraps up our ultimate guide to elemental reactions and internal cooldown mechanics in Genshin Impact. Mastering these systems will definitely elevate your gameplay, whether you're taking on challenging bosses or optimizing your team compositions. Don't forget to experiment with different element combos and character abilities to see what works best for your playstyle. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all things Genshin Impact. Drop a comment below if you have any questions or want to share your own reaction combos. Thanks for watching, and see you in next video.